I work as a child professional, and one of the kids that I look after had recently gotten into hiking. I decided to take him to a really cool trail in Salt Fork State Park. We were all set to hike Jose's Cave after parking right near the beginning of the trailhead. The entrance trail is about half a mile, which is why I chose this trail for our hike that day. I chose this trail because any time that I had been on it before, it was very busy and full of people, a very popular spot, which made me feel secure at the time. However, this past summer, we had a cluster of severe summer storms that caused massive damage to that trail. So to my surprise, it was much more difficult and completely empty. I wasn't bothered by the trail being obviously empty, because there was a small construction crew working on a bridge that had just barely been visible from the trailhead. He was still up for that hike despite the entire width of the trail being washed out, leaving no more than a foot wide, maybe, with a 6 to 12 foot deep drop-off into the creek bed. He's very athletic, and I was confident in his abilities, so he was excited to tackle our new adventure. We made it all the way down to a platform that allows you to see the entire cave. There are many downed trees surrounding that platform. It was actually closed at this point, but we made it this far, so we decided to continue down to the platform and proceed a few hundred feet into the cave. We spent most of the time in this area due to the difficulty, so we knew exactly what it looked like. There were tree roots directly under the platform, and you could climb down either side of them. It's also worth noting that Jose's Cave is much more like a cliff, with an overhanging rock formation and a trickle of waterfall directly in the middle. It's not a creepy, closed-up cave. It's very open and beautiful. As we got into the cave, I noticed that there was a candle, though it was not burning but had recently been lit at some point. It was sitting on a large rock that had a heart carved into it. I chalked it up to someone having a date or something, and just disregarded it. He wanted to climb up to the top, where I noticed 2 more candles and 3 stacks of small rocks that had been stacked up by someone. I don't know why, but I definitely felt weird at this point. He later found a small puddle full of baby salamanders and wanted to catch them. That was the happiest I'd seen him in a very long time. I didn't have the heart to tell him that it was time to go. We spent an hour or so catching baby salamanders, and I watched him have the time of his life. I decided not long after that, it was time to leave. When we got back to that platform, dead center in the middle of the tree roots was this wet washcloth hanging. It was absolutely not there before. He even noticed and pointed it out as well, but I did not pick up on the severity of the situation that we were now in at the moment. I actually knew 2 things. 1, someone was watching us. We did not see them, but they saw us. And 2, they were now potentially hiding in the woods, and made a point to not be seen, but to leave an object there to be noticed by us. There was no running back to that narrow trail, and I was not about to tell him that we were in potential danger. I told him to go in front of me, and I just kept encouraging him, telling him he was doing great over and over. That seemed to speed him up naturally. I never saw anyone while we were on the trail, though. We finally got back to the car, and I locked the doors immediately. On our way out of the park, a very dirty man, I'd say in his 30s, came out of the woods and made a point to just stare at me with the most empty expression I've ever seen. He followed me with his eyes and his head as I drove by him. He continued to stare at me until I couldn't see him in the rearview mirror anymore. He made it a point to make himself apparent to me. Now I knew that facts 1 and 2 were true. His face and that stare stuck with me for days. I considered counseling after this, as it bothered me for several weeks, causing me to have severe anxiety. I tried to tell myself that maybe we just interrupted his bath time and he was camping and didn't want to startle us. After all, a crazy-looking man had ample time to do anything he wanted while we were catching salamanders. I just cannot, in any way, rationalize why he stared into my eyes the way he did. The kid I took hiking still has no idea how panicked I was. To this day, it's still the most fun I've ever seen him have. He still brings it up on the regular. It was a very positive experience overall for him, but for me, it was one of my worst experiences ever. I still feel sick and disturbed even writing this. I had been working as a forest ranger in the US for more than 10 years, and most of the time the days blended into each other. Long hours alone watching over the forest, I was assigned to a small old cabin deep in a part of the forest where not many people go. The cabin was basic. No electricity, just a wood stove for heat, a bed, and a few things to get by. It had been built years ago by rangers before me. I liked being out there, away from everything, surrounded by nothing but trees for miles. One evening, after finishing my rounds, I settled into the cabin, ready to call it a night. The sun had just gone down, and the sky was turning dark. I lit an old lantern and sat down at the small wooden table to jot down some notes about the day. The forest was quieter than usual. Normally you'd hear crickets, the wind moving through the trees, maybe an owl in the distance, but that night there was nothing, just complete silence. At first, I didn't think much of it. Some nights were like that, where the animals seemed to disappear. I went back to writing, trying to ignore the strange stillness. After a little while, I heard a sound outside. It was faint, like something moving through the leaves. I stood up and looked out the small window, but there was nothing there. It could have been anything. A deer, a raccoon, or maybe just the wind. But then the sound got closer. It wasn't a soft rustling anymore. It was a slow, steady crunch of leaves and branches, like something or someone was walking toward the cabin. I reached for my flashlight on the table, clicked it on, and pointed it out the window. The light cut through the darkness, but all I saw were the trees and shadows. No movement, no animals, just the same eerie silence. I sat back down, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The cabin was small, and I'd always felt safe there, even in worse conditions out in the wild. But that night, I couldn't relax. The uneasy feeling stuck with me, and I found myself glancing out the window every few minutes, half expecting to see something watching me. Then, just when I thought I might be overthinking it, I heard a loud thud against the side of the cabin. It was sharp and sudden, like something heavy had hit the wood wall. I jumped up, my heart racing, and grabbed the flashlight again. Slowly, I opened the door and stepped out onto the small porch. The night was pitch black, except for where my flashlight shone. The trees stood tall and still, their branches barely moving in the slight breeze. I looked around but saw nothing out of the ordinary. No signs of an animal, no fallen branches. The ground looked untouched. But then I noticed something that made my skin crawl. The silence was back, heavier than before. Even the breeze had stopped. It was like the whole forest was holding its breath. I scanned the trees one last time before heading back inside and locking the door. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was just being out here too long, maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. I had spent too many nights alone in the woods. I went to bed, but sleep was hard to come by. I stayed alert, listening for any sound, waiting for that noise to come back. Hours passed, and at some point I must have drifted off. But when I woke up, it was still dark, and something was wrong. I sat up and realized the cabin door was open. My heart pounded in my chest. I knew for sure I had locked it. I got out of bed and grabbed my flashlight from the table. I clicked it on and aimed it at the door. It was wide open, slowly creaking on its hinges. My mind raced, trying to figure out what had happened. Was it the wind? But there hadn't been any wind strong enough to do that. Was it an animal? But animals don't open doors. I froze, standing there in the middle of the cabin, unsure of what to do next. That's when I saw it, footprints in the dirt just outside the door. They were human. The tracks led away from the cabin, disappearing into the darkness of the trees. Someone had been out there. They had been close enough to open the door without me hearing them. I hadn't heard a thing. I stood there, flashlight in hand, paralyzed by the thought of what had happened. Whoever it was, they were still out there. Maybe they were watching me right now from the woods, hidden in the shadows, waiting for me to step outside. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I sat at the table, flashlight ready, listening to every creak and crack. When the first light of dawn finally broke through the trees, I packed up my things and left the cabin. I didn't stop walking until I made it to the ranger station, miles away. I filed a report, but deep down, I knew they wouldn't find anything. The forest was too big, too isolated. Whoever it was, they knew the area better than I did. They knew how to move quietly, how to stay hidden. I never went back to that cabin. Even now, I still wonder who or what was out there that night. I wonder if they're still in those woods, watching, waiting for the next ranger to come by. Whoever they weren't looking for a conversation. They were waiting for something. And whatever it was, I wasn't sticking around to find out. It was a cold November weekend when my college friends and I decided to rent a cabin in the mountains to get away from exams. The cabin was far from anything, tucked deep in the woods, and we thought it would be a perfect break from our busy campus life. We got there in the late afternoon, and the setting sun made long shadows through the trees. The cabin was old but cozy, with creaky floorboards and a big stone fireplace that crackled with warmth. We unpacked and spent the evening playing games and hanging out. By midnight, the cabin was quiet, except for the occasional gust of wind rattling the windows. I had the top bunk in the room we had turned into a makeshift dorm. As I was trying to fall asleep, I heard a faint noise coming from outside. It sounded like something scratching or dragging across the ground. I tried to ignore it, thinking it was just branches hitting the cabin or maybe an animal. The noise got louder and more persistent. It seemed to be coming from the back of the cabin. I got up, went to the window, and looked out. It was so dark I couldn't see anything but trees and shadows. I decided to check it out, thinking it was probably just a branch stuck somewhere. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside, the cold air hitting me hard. The noise was clearer now, definitely something scraping. I walked around to the back of the cabin, shining the light around. The ground was covered in leaves and dirt, but I couldn't see what was making the sound. Then I saw something strange, a fresh trail of disturbed earth leading away from the cabin. The trail was narrow and seemed to lead toward a small overgrown shed we hadn't noticed before. My heart started to race. The noise had stopped, but I felt uneasy. I approached the shed, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The door was slightly open, and I hesitated before pushing it wide. Inside, it was completely dark, and I could barely make out old tools and a few rusty barrels. I didn't see anything strange, but the creepy feeling didn't go away. Just as I turned to leave, the flashlight flickered and went out. I struggled with the battery, my hands shaking. When I finally got it working again, the light revealed a dark figure standing just outside the shed. It was tall, and its shape blended into the shadows. Fear hit me hard, and I ran back to the cabin. I slammed the door shut behind me, breathing heavily. I couldn't sleep that night, my mind racing with thoughts of what I had seen. In the morning, we discovered deep, jagged claw marks on the cabin's wooden siding. It looked like something had tried to claw its way in. We packed up quickly and left, feeling a heavy sense of dread as we drove back to college. No one said much about what happened, but it was clear that whatever we had seen wasn't just an ordinary animal. The cabin had seemed like a fun escape, but it ended with a terrifying reminder that sometimes being alone in the woods can bring you face to face with something you're better off not knowing. And the worst part, the claw marks were still there, deep and ugly. A silent witness to whatever had been trying to get inside. I had always wanted to get away for a weekend, away from the noise of the city. Renting an old cabin in the woods seemed like a good idea at the time. I found one online, cheap, far from everything, no cell signal or internet. It sounded perfect. I packed up a few things, grabbed my sleeping bag, and left early that Friday morning. When I got there, the cabin looked just like the pictures. It was old, built from dark wood that had seen way too many winters. The roof drooped a bit, and the windows were small and dirty, hard to see through. There was a little porch with one rocking chair. Trees surrounded the cabin so tightly that only a bit of sunlight could get through. It felt like I had traveled back in time. It was completely silent except for the leaves rustling and the wind making the cabin creak a little. I unpacked my stuff and stepped inside. The cabin smelled like dust and wet wood. There were only 2 rooms. A tiny kitchen with an old rusty stove, and the main room with a fireplace and a bed that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. A few animal skins hung on the walls, giving the place a weird, distant feeling like it didn't belong to this time. That first night, I started a fire in the fireplace and sat down to read. The wind was getting stronger outside, brushing against the cabin, but inside it was quiet. Too quiet. I could only hear the fire crackling. And before I knew it, I was falling asleep. In the middle of the night, I woke up suddenly. The fire had almost burned out, leaving the room in complete darkness, and the wind outside was now a constant howl. At first, I thought it was just the noise that had woken me up, but then I heard something else. A soft scraping sound. It was faint, but I could hear it. It was coming from the back wall of the cabin, right behind the bed. I stayed still, listening carefully. The sound was quiet but steady, like something or someone was dragging something sharp across the wood. My heart started beating faster, but I tried to tell myself it was probably just an animal outside. I closed my eyes, trying to ignore it, hoping it would stop. It didn't. I got out of bed, grabbed the flashlight I had brought, and walked to the back window. I shone the light outside, expecting to see a raccoon or maybe a branch scraping against the cabin, but there was nothing. The trees were swaying in the wind, leaves scattered on the ground, but no animal, no branch. I went back to bed, trying to brush it off, but the scraping kept going, slow and steady, all night long. By the next morning, the noise had stopped, and I convinced myself it was nothing. I spent the day hiking around the woods nearby, trying to enjoy the quiet, but the whole time I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. Every time I stopped to look around, the trees were still, but I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on me. That night, as soon as the fire started to die down, the noise came back. This time it was louder, and it wasn't just behind the bed, it was circling the cabin slowly. The scraping sound moved around the outside walls like something was dragging its nails along the wood, tracing a path around the cabin. Cold sweat started to drip down my neck. I grabbed the flashlight again and moved toward the door, ready to see what was out there, but the second my hand touched the doorknob, the scraping stopped. I stood there frozen, listening. The silence was thick. Then I heard a heavy thud right against the front door. I backed away slowly, feeling my heart hammering in my chest. For the next few hours, the noise picked up again, moving faster around the cabin, mixing with loud bangs against the walls. I felt trapped. Every time I thought about opening the door, the sound grew louder, like it was warning me to stay inside. I couldn't take it anymore. I waited until the noise finally stopped, and as soon as the first bit of morning light came through the window, I grabbed my stuff and rushed to my car. I didn't care what was outside or what had been making those noises. I just knew I had to get out of there. As I drove away, I glanced back at the cabin one last time. It looked just the same as it did when I first got there. Old, quiet, like it had been forgotten. But now, something about it felt different, as if it had been watching me the whole time. And the scraping stopped the second I left. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away, back on familiar roads. I didn't look back after that, but whatever was out there, it was real, and it wasn't just in my head. I don't know why the noises only happened at night, or what was causing them, but here's the part that keeps me up at night. I looked up the cabin when I got home, just to see if anyone else had noticed anything strange about it. The listing had been taken down, and I couldn't find it anywhere, like it had never existed. I don't know who or what was out there, but it didn't want me there, and I know I'll never be able to forget that sound. My story takes place in northern Italy back in 2015. It was early December, and a friend of mine proposed that we take a short hike in the woods near his town. I obviously agreed. I love hiking in nature. We prepared our backpacks, grabbed some food, and drove out to the place. My friend knew the area very well, so we didn't take a map with us, nor did we have flashlights. We didn't plan on staying that late. As we got deeper and deeper into those woods, we passed a few beautiful spots. A small river, a pair of caves that we actually explored, and we had lunch before proceeding to follow a trail deeper into the woods. After about half an hour, we arrived at a pretty large clearing, and here comes the scary part. Inside that clearing were a bunch of people, I'd say maybe 4 to 5, dressed normally. They were just simply talking and laughing. It wasn't some kind of satanic cult, nor were they doing any dreadful chants or praying in a circle. They were ordinary people like me and my friend, talking with one another. They saw us too, since the clearing had no trees or rocks to cover the view, so we couldn't avoid them. We approached them and said, "Hey there, what's up?" No one answered back. They continued to stare at us without saying a single word. This obviously raised a huge red flag for both of us. We stopped and I looked at my mate. He looked back at me with a concerned look too, so we said again, "Hey." Still, no answer. I started to feel really uneasy, so we decided to just turn back and return to our car. Not long after we turned around and started heading back towards our vehicle, we realized they were following us. I turned around and asked them, "Hey, did we do something wrong?" Again, no answer, but they continued to follow us. We proceeded to walk faster and faster, trying to get off the trail as quickly as we could, but they followed the entire time, staying about 15 meters away. Both of us started to panic, looked at each other, and agreed to just run. As soon as we did, they started to run too. Now we were freaking out. We did our best to put more distance between them and us. We were still 40 minutes away from our car in a very isolated area deep within the woods. I felt completely helpless. We were about halfway back when we started to notice that they weren't behind us anymore. I thought maybe, luckily, we had managed to lose them. As soon as I noticed this, we hid behind a thick bush and just tried to listen. Silence. No footsteps. No voices. We sat there for a few more moments, caught our breath, and then finally managed to get back to the car, trying to be as silent as possible the whole way. We jumped inside the car and raced the hell out of there. The story doesn't end here. As we left those woods and hit the main road, we saw, coming from a secondary road, another car behind us. It was them. They were following us again. Now, in those moments, we had no confirmation that it was them, but they were basically tailgating us, riding our ass the entire time. That area is very rarely visited, and there are absolutely zero cars, except for my friends and maybe another one. That car had no license plates. We drove back to my friend's town, avoiding his house, taking every country road we could think of. Every turn we made, they did as well. As we reached the town, we made a U-turn and headed back toward the woods. We were freaking terrified. We informed the local police about what had happened and asked them to check that area out, but to our knowledge, no evidence came of it, and we never heard back from them. We never saw them again, but in the following days, we were super paranoid and didn't even want to leave our houses. This is why I took a break from hiking for about 4 years. I still have no idea who those people were, what they wanted, or why they followed us. This experience gave me PTSD. It was horrifying. I hope we never see them again. I drove up to the cabin, the tall trees standing dark and foreboding against the setting sun. This place held memories of better times when we were together, enjoying life's simple pleasures. But after the divorce, I hadn't been back. I thought it might help to spend a weekend alone to think things over, and maybe stir up some old feelings. The air felt stale, filled with the smell of old firewood and forgotten laughter. I dropped my bags and opened the windows, letting in the cool evening breeze. The sounds of nature began to break the silence. The rustling leaves, the chirping crickets, and the occasional hoot of an owl. It was calm, but there was a strange feeling in the air that I couldn't shake off. That night, I lit a fire in the stone fireplace and settled into a chair with a book. As I turned the pages, something flickered in the corner of my eye, a shadow moving just outside the window. I paused, straining to see into the darkness, but nothing was there. I tried to tell myself it was just a trick of the light or my imagination playing games. As the fire crackled, my thoughts drifted back to happier times. I remembered our first trip to this cabin, the laughter we shared, the warmth of our hugs under the stars. But those memories felt far away, like a dream that had faded with the morning. I shook off the thoughts and went back to reading, hoping to push away the creepy feeling creeping up my spine. Around midnight, I heard a noise outside, a soft thud, like something heavy dropping to the ground. My heart started racing as I set the book aside and listened. The cabin was dark, lit only by the flickering firelight. I grabbed a flashlight, my hands shaking as I opened the door and stepped outside. The air was cold against my skin, and the forest felt alive around me. I shone the flashlight into the darkness, looking for anything strange. Suddenly, I saw a figure just beyond the tree line, half hidden in the shadows. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. It was a man, tall and broad, standing still as if waiting for me to make a move. A wave of fear hit me, mixed with an odd sense of familiarity. He looked like someone I used to know, a flashback to a summer spent with friends. I wanted to call out, but no words came. The figure took a step closer and panic surged through me. I turned and ran back into the cabin, locking the door behind me. Inside, I felt both safe and trapped. My heart pounded as I tried to calm myself. Minutes passed, and the only sound was the crackling fire. Then came a loud knock on the door, shaking the wood frame. My heart raced again, and I grabbed the fireplace poker, gripping it tightly in my hand. The knock came again, more urgent this time. I couldn't see who it was through the peephole, but I couldn't just stand there. I knew I had to face whatever or whoever was out there. With a deep breath, I opened the door a crack, flashlight aimed at the figure outside. To my shock, it was my ex-wife. She stood there, her eyes wide with fear and regret. Relief washed over me, but confusion quickly followed. She had come looking for me, worried when I didn't reply to her texts. We both felt a rush of emotions, recalling our shared past. She stepped inside, and I closed the door behind her. The warmth of the cabin felt different now, heavy with unspoken tension. As we sat by the fire, sharing bits of our lives since the split, I realized that this weekend was more than just a chance to think. It was an opportunity to reconnect, to see if we could build something new from what we lost. We talked late into the night, laughter and memories filling the space. Outside, the darkness loomed, but inside, an uneasy warmth began to grow. Just then, we heard a noise, a sharp rustle outside, followed by a low, menacing growl. The laughter died on our lips as we exchanged uneasy glances. I grabbed the flashlight again and aimed it toward the window. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing at first. Then, just at the edge of the trees, I caught sight of something, two glowing eyes staring back at us, unblinking and hungry. My heart dropped as the reality hit me. This wasn't just a feeling. We were not alone. The growl came again, louder this time, echoing in the quiet night. My ex-wife's face went pale as the shadows shifted outside, revealing the shape of a large creature moving closer, blending in and out of the trees. I gripped the poker tighter, knowing that whatever it wasn't friendly. Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out. The fire dimmed, and we were plunged into darkness. Panic set in as I scrambled to keep calm. The creature was now right outside the cabin, its breathing heavy and labored. We could hear the claws scraping against the wooden walls, searching for a way in. I turned to my ex-wife, but she had gone quiet, fear written all over her face. In that moment, I realized that even in this frightening situation, our shared past felt like a distant memory. The connection we were trying to rebuild felt fragile, like the flickering flame of the fire that could go out at any moment. Just as I felt the weight of despair settle in, the scratching stopped. The cabin was eerily silent, but we knew it wasn't over. The feeling of being hunted hung in the air, making it hard to breathe. Outside, the darkness thickened, and the eyes disappeared, leaving us with only the sound of our racing hearts. I knew then that this cabin would hold more than just our memories. It would become a place of fear and uncertainty. Perhaps we'd come seeking comfort, but we found only dread, a chilling reminder that the past could come back in the most unexpected ways. The weekend wasn't just a second chance, it was a fight for survival, and we both realized the darkness outside was nothing compared to the shadows we carried within. I had always wanted to visit the French countryside. The thought of spending a few days in a quiet cabin away from everything sounded perfect, so I found a small cabin tucked away deep in the woods, far from the city noise. It seemed like the perfect place to relax. There was nothing around but trees and the sound of the wind, no cars, no people, just quiet. The first night was peaceful. I sat by the fire, sipping on some wine and just watched the flames flicker. It was so quiet, almost too quiet. There was something strange about the silence, but I told myself I just wasn't used to it. After living in the city for years, this kind of quiet would take some getting used to. But the second night was different. As soon as it got dark, I started feeling strange. It was like something wasn't right. I kept looking out the windows, expecting to see something, but there was nothing. Just trees and darkness. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was out there, watching me. I tried reading to calm myself down, but I couldn't focus. Every creak of the floor, every gust of wind against the windows made me jump. At one point, I thought I heard something outside, like someone walking through the leaves. I froze, listening closely, but the sound stopped just as quickly as it started. I hurried to lock the doors and shut all the windows, telling myself it was just an animal. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The next morning, I decided to go for a walk through the woods, hoping it would help me relax. The fresh air helped at first, and I started to feel better. But after walking for a while, I realized I had lost my way. The trees were thick, and everything started to look the same. I tried to find the path back to the cabin, but after about an hour of walking, I knew I was lost. I didn't have a map, and my phone had no signal. Panic started to set in. I picked a direction and walked faster, hoping it would lead me back. But the deeper I went into the woods, the more confused I became. Everything around me looked identical. Endless trees, no landmarks, no signs of the cabin. By the time the sun started to set, I still hadn't found my way back. I knew I'd have to spend the night out there. I found a small open area and decided to stay there. As it got dark, the woods around me went completely silent again. That same feeling I had the night before returned, only worse. This time, I didn't sleep. Every little sound, the leaves moving, twigs snapping, made my heart race. At one point in the middle of the night, I heard footsteps behind me, slow, careful steps. I held my breath, heart pounding. The footsteps stopped after a while, but I never heard them walk away. It was like whatever was out there had stopped, standing just out of sight, waiting. When the sun came up, I hurried to pack my things and walked as fast as I could. After hours of wandering, I finally saw the cabin through the trees, but something was wrong. The front door was wide open. I know I had locked it before I left. I walked inside carefully. Everything looked the same, but there was something strange about the air inside, like the place wasn't quite right. I checked all the windows. They were still locked from the inside, just as I had left them. Nothing seemed missing, but the feeling was still there, that someone had been inside while I was gone, watching. I didn't waste any time. I grabbed my things, left the cabin, and started driving. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, expecting to see someone standing in the doorway watching me leave. As I drove away, the feeling didn't go away. In fact, it got stronger, like something was still following me. Even now, months later, I can't shake the feeling. Every time I step outside, it feels like someone's watching from the shadows, waiting. I never saw anyone, but I know I wasn't alone in those woods. I don't think I ever will be again. I was alone at my cabin for the weekend, a rare chance to get away from everything. My neighbor's cabin was only a short walk through the trees, but they were away on vacation. I had planned on a peaceful weekend of reading and relaxing, but things took a creepy turn. It started on the second night. I was lying in bed when I heard a faint noise outside, like something scraping along the ground. I thought it was just the wind, or maybe an animal, but it kept bothering me. I tried to ignore it and went back to sleep. The next morning, I noticed fresh tracks in the dirt leading from the neighbor's cabin toward mine. They were strange, not like any animal tracks I knew. I figured someone might have been passing through and just taken a shortcut. That night, the noise came back, but it was louder and closer. I stayed still, listening as the sounds moved around the cabin. It was clearly human footsteps and rustling. My heart raced as I lay there, too frightened to move. The cabin was locked tight, but I felt exposed and vulnerable. When the noise finally stopped, I forced myself to check outside. I saw that the tracks from earlier had changed direction. They led away from my cabin, back toward the neighbor's place. Something felt seriously wrong. I decided to act. I called the local sheriff's office and explained what was going on. They said they'd send someone over, though it might take some time. While I waited, I kept my phone close, staying alert and ready for anything. When the deputy arrived, they discovered signs of a break-in attempt at the neighbor's cabin. It turned out someone had been watching the area for days, planning to break in. They had also been keeping an eye on my cabin, maybe thinking about hitting it next. The deputy told me there had been a string of similar break-ins in the area and warned me to be extra cautious. The realization that someone had been so close, watching me, was terrifying. I was relieved I hadn't confronted them alone. The sheriff's office promised increased patrols, but the fear lingered. I made sure to lock every door and window tightly that night. The cabin felt even more like a prison. I kept the lights on and the doors locked, unable to shake the feeling of being watched. The peaceful retreat I had hoped for was replaced by a constant sense of dread. As I lay in bed, the sound of something scratching at the window made my blood run cold. I knew I wasn't alone, and the thought that someone might still be out there waiting for their chance left me with a chilling sense of fear. I'm a small-town police officer, and when I was assigned to watch over a cabin in the woods for a night, it seemed like an easy task. The cabin belonged to a retired officer who had recently passed away, and his family wanted to keep an eye on it until they decided what to do with it. My job was to patrol the cabin every few hours to make sure nothing was wrong. The cabin was in the middle of a thick forest, far from the nearest house. My job was to keep an eye on the place and make sure no one was breaking in. The cabin was old and creaky, but it had a kind of old-fashioned charm. I got there just before dark and set up my patrol plan, writing everything down in the logbook. Around midnight, I decided to walk around the cabin. The forest was quiet, except for the occasional rustle of leaves and a distant bird call. I didn't see anything strange until I got to the back of the cabin. That's when I noticed fresh footprints leading up to the back door. My heart started racing. I checked the door. It was locked, but the footprints went around the side of the cabin. I followed them carefully, shining my flashlight through the dark. The tracks led to a small shed behind the cabin. I approached the shed, my nerves on edge. The shed was old and looked like it hadn't been used in years. I slowly opened the door, and it creaked loudly. Inside, I found old tools and dusty furniture. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary until I spotted a small dusty box in the corner. The box was open, and inside were old photos and papers. I picked up a photo and looked at it. It showed the retired officer with a group of men, all smiling and holding what looked like hunting rifles. Then my flashlight beam moved and revealed something that made my blood run cold. There was a dark stain on the floor beneath the box, looking almost like spilled coffee, but much more disturbing. I crouched down to look closer and realized it was dried blood. My mind raced. Why was there blood here? And what had happened in this cabin? I called for backup and decided to wait by the cabin until they arrived. As I stood outside, I heard footsteps coming from the forest. I froze, swinging my flashlight toward the noise. The footsteps stopped just outside the cabin, and I saw a shadowy figure through the window. Backup arrived quickly. Together we searched the area but found nothing. The shadowy figure had disappeared, and the footprints in the shed were gone. We thoroughly checked the cabin and the shed, but there was no sign of anyone or anything that could explain the blood or the figure I had seen. The case was never solved. The retired officer's family eventually decided to sell the cabin, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible had happened there. Every time I drove past the cabin, I couldn't help but feel that the forest was hiding something. It was as if whatever had been in that cabin was still out there, waiting for someone else to uncover the truth. The feeling that something was watching me from the trees never left me, a constant reminder of the dark secrets buried in that quiet, forgotten place. It had been years since I last went to the old family cabin. My grandparents had lived there for as long as I could remember, deep in the woods, far from the noise of town. They loved it out there, and I used to visit them every summer when I was younger. But after my grandfather passed away, my grandmother didn't stay long. She moved closer to us into a small house in town and left the cabin empty. No one really went up there anymore. I always meant to go check on the place, but life got busy. Then one weekend, I finally decided to make the trip. I drove up the same bumpy dirt road, twisting through the trees, my car shaking like it always did on that uneven path. The cabin looked just like it had before, sitting quietly in the middle of the forest. When I went inside, everything seemed fine at first. There was a layer of dust on the furniture, and the air smelled stale, but it wasn't surprising after all this time. The silence in the cabin was so deep it made my ears ring. I spent the day cleaning up a bit, wiping off the counters, sweeping the floors. It felt peaceful, but there was something about being alone there that made me uneasy. By evening, the sun was going down, and the shadows in the trees seemed to stretch longer than usual. The cabin, which had once felt cozy and warm, now seemed too quiet. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself it was just because I wasn't used to being out here anymore. I went to bed early, thinking I'd sleep soundly after a long day of work, but I woke up in the middle of the night, feeling strange. The cabin was completely silent. No creaks, no wind outside, nothing. But it felt wrong. It felt like I wasn't alone. Lying there in the dark, my mind went back to the last time I'd visited my grandparents. That summer had felt different. My grandmother had been quieter than usual. She hardly said a word, which wasn't like her. My grandfather had been tense too. I was too young at the time to understand why, but thinking back, I realized they had been on edge that summer. They never talked about it, but I remembered the heavy feeling in the cabin, the same one I was feeling now. I tried to push those thoughts away and go back to sleep, but I couldn't relax. Then I heard a noise. It was a dull thud, just once, but it echoed in the silence. My heart started racing, but I stayed still, waiting to hear it again. There it was, another thud. This time it sounded closer, like it came from the front of the cabin. I couldn't explain why, but I knew it wasn't the wind or some animal outside. It felt intentional. I got out of bed, moving quietly so I wouldn't make any noise. I didn't turn on any lights, just crept through the darkness, my eyes adjusting. The old wooden floor creaked under my feet as I walked toward the living room. I waited there, standing still in the dark, but the noise didn't come again. For some reason, I felt the urge to open the front door, like I needed to know what was out there. I opened it slowly, expecting to see something, but the porch was empty. The trees were still, the wind barely moving through them. Then I noticed something. Footprints in the dirt, just at the bottom of the steps. They weren't there when I had arrived earlier, and they were fresh, still sharp in the dirt. They led away from the cabin, into the trees. I stared at those footprints for what felt like forever, my mind spinning. Someone had been here, standing right at the edge of the porch. They hadn't knocked, hadn't called out, just stood there in the dark, watching. I slammed the door shut and locked it. My heart pounded as I stood in the middle of the cabin, trying to figure out what was happening. The air inside felt heavy again, like whoever had been outside had never really left. I stayed awake the rest of the night, listening for any noise, any sign that they were still out there. But the quiet never broke again. It stayed silent, almost too silent, as if the cabin itself was holding its breath. When the first light of morning finally came through the windows, I grabbed my stuff and left. I didn't bother cleaning up or looking back. I just got in my car and started driving. As I drove down the dirt road, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been watched all night. Not just from outside, but from inside the cabin too. Something had been off in that place, something I hadn't noticed when I was younger. It hit me then why my grandmother had left so suddenly after my grandfather passed. It wasn't just grief or wanting to be closer to family. She knew. She knew something wasn't right about that cabin. I had felt it too, in the way the air seemed thick, in the way the silence felt wrong. Something had been out there that night, and maybe it had always been there. As I drove further away, I looked in the rearview mirror, and for a second, I thought I saw a figure standing on the porch. But when I looked again, it was gone. I don't know what it was or who it was, but I know one thing for sure. I'm never going back to that cabin again. Something isn't right in those woods, and whatever it is, I don't want to find out.